We're back. I'm Jack, your British goat, and today we got the Cold War Oversimplified Part 2. Let's go. It's been a
For anyone who
couple of
thinks
days since we did Part 1.
has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you.
I will say that I definitely think I got kind of the wrong end of the stick of what the Cold War was, especially watching Part 1. I thought this was a war. So far, it's not. So I'll see what we're seeing in Part 2.
Extreme cultural division,
I was
major
expecting
political
fighting.
assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat.
I'll be honest, I'll be completely honest, I said I've known nothing about the Cold War. I never have. Part 1 confused me because I'm seeing the word war and I'm thinking this is a war between America and Russia. You know, hopefully by the time this one's come out, there's some comments from the Part 1 that I've released, and I might have a bit more of understanding, and I might learn more in the next 15 minutes, but...
For America,
I'm
Castro
so
felt there was
confused.
still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida.
Right,
Hey,
yeah.
I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. No, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications...
It is crazy that I don't know anything about this. Like, we don't learn anything like this. Like I just said in Part 1, history... I stopped learning history at 12 years old. I didn't pick it for my extra studies. I chose geography instead, so... But I wouldn't have learned any of this anyway. This isn't the type of thing we would have learned.
Two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's
learned
demands for the
bollocks
missiles
like
to be
the
removed. And
Victorian
for the first time in
times.
history, U.S. Strategic Air
shit about
Command
that.
moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency.
I've heard the name
Unfortunately
Castro.
for him, his
And
presidency
isn't this is why...
was
I
to
was going
end
to say,
with
this
war.
isn't why he was
Having
killed,
nearly
right?
blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty.
conspiracy.
Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be
But you wouldn't tell them how much you've got, so that makes sense to me that they
destroyed
found
by
that
a
out.
nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay.
Never heard of
What are we gonna
this.
do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't.
Wow.
Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah. I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union...
Wait, there's some on my
time
country?
America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950.
Dickheads.
Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more...
We will do a video on the Vietnam War because someone commented saying that's literally the only war the Americans have ever lost. So we'll definitely be checking out one of those as well.
To support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought
that's only 60 years
before.
ago.
Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier.
I generally cannot see anything.
Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war,
I'll tell you what, like this is incredibly interesting. Like, I obviously started this as a sport channel, but man, I'm loving doing these history videos.
Superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US...
The fuck is that?
backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin
I knew nothing about that.
Superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming
levels pause it for a second, because this is like
of human...
Operation Condor, Nigeria is being brought into this, Bolivia, East Timor, Ethiopia. Jesus Christ, like this is... I haven't heard of a single one of these. Wow.
Suffering throughout the third world. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root, make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. And in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell.
Wow.
The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the
Right.
first US president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the US table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1970.
Someone let me know, what is this country that is not coloured in there? Is that Mongolia?
72,
Probably
and
not
it was a
sound like an
barrel
idiot
of
there,
laughs.
but I don't know.
Today, the president walks
No
among
idea.
priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
Ah.
You put the stuff into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of these.
他是不是给我一对啊？
Laughs like a schoolgirl's eating cake.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America the people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor.
Why are
President
their
Brezhnev.
lips
Likewise,
like that?
President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response
not
to these
know
various
they
crises,
invaded Afghanistan.
Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft, and in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back.
I'll tell you what, there's just so much information being thrown at me here. Like, again, I'll openly admit it, I've obviously got the wrong idea of what the Cold War was going into this. But man, this is spanning decades, and just I'm gonna have to check out more things, because this is just too much.
Mid-20th century
This
Cold
is
War
too
tension.
much
But then
information.
Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced
So
by
when
this
do
guy
we
who was
get
really
to,
old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985,
matey
he
boy
was
in
the
Russia
real
now. What the
game
fuck's he
changer.
called?
His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet
What is he? Putin.
leaders. He felt that the reason the
When did
Soviet
he come
system
in?
and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began
Right.
the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue
For sure.
reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question.
I was thinking, when are these countries not going to become part of the Union? I said in part one, and I won't say which one of these countries, but one side of my family comes from one of these, and I don't know if it was like
on Hungary's
this.
lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response, he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But
Wow.
not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist,
They still
Erich
have-
Honecker,
okay.
and many East Germans were
I thought
still
it was a
eager
lot
to
earlier
get
than
out.
that.
They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now
Yeah.
they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using
Wow.
various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was
I'm actually really annoyed. I don't know any of this. Like, it's
furious and
awful
blocked travel
that I
to
don't-
Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to
I
the
understand
West
why
German
we're not
embassy in
taught
Prague,
it, but-
where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens and a temporary refugee camp was set up.
There's
In
only like
September,
10 or
deals
11.
were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of
Jeez.
their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force, right guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November
Wow.
4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left
so
in
the wall is still up in 1989. Okay.
their sights. That damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban
So
between
I'm
East and
currently
West
not
was
alive
being
for another
lifted. The
8-9
change wasn't
years
meant to
at
take
this point.
effect until the next day, and crossing guards
I didn't
still
know it
had
was that
orders to
close
shoot
to,
on
like,
sight
my-
any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East
Wow.
and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria.
That was only 1990. So I was born in 96. You've heard of the Berlin Wall. In my head, 70s.
Peaceful
Wow,
revolution in
okay.
Czechoslovakia
This
and a violent
is-
one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it
That
just
was in
stayed
the
away
90s.
and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic. So believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet
Wait,
Union. Communist
okay.
hardliners were horrified
That's
at what
confused me.
Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other
Jeez.
words, you're no longer in charge. I am.
Wait, so those other things are going to become Ukraine, Belarus. Was Croatia and Bosnia, are they part of that as well?
And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic
Is that like
governments were established
Kazakhstan,
in many of the old Soviet republics.
Uzbekistan?
And the world got along together forever after. Right, guys? Hey, this modern art thing is growing on me. Where can I learn to do that? Skillshare.
Alright, W skip. Okay. My thoughts of what the Cold War was, clearly not what it is. That was incredibly interesting and far too much information just to retain from this one video. So let me know if there's other things I should check out to kind of learn more about the Cold War. Should we check Vietnam out? Let me know that, of course, way down there. Hit the like button and subscribe button. Hope you have a great day. Peace.